Excuse me, young man. The flight attendant's voice was smooth but cold, laced with an air of superiority. She kept her professional smile, but her eyes told a different story. First class isn't for people like you. Marcus Reynolds, a slender black teenager, blinked, momentarily thrown off by her words. His grip tightened around the crisp first-class ticket in his hand. He glanced down at it as if to reassure himself that he was standing exactly where he was supposed to be. Then he met her disdainful gaze with quiet resolve. "I have a valid ticket," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I belong here." The flight attendant, Madeline Brooks, let out a soft, mocking laugh. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make it personal. "Either you leave on your own or I'll have security handle it." What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined, was that the black teenager she had just tried to humiliate was no ordinary passenger. He was the son of Thomas Reynolds, the billionaire owner of Reynolds Aviation, the very airline she worked for, and she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Just hours before this moment, Marcus had strolled through the sleek, bustling halls of Pine Haven International Airport, his small suitcase gliding smoothly across the polished floor. Among the sea of travelers, businessmen in tailored suits, vacationers in designer outfits, he stood out, not because of his attire, but because of his presence. At 17 years old, Marcus was not just any teenager. He had just finished his final semester at an elite high school, graduating at the top of his class. With a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the country, today was supposed to be a day of celebration. His father had gifted him this first-class ticket as a reward for his hard work, a chance to enjoy the luxury he rarely indulged in. But Marcus never flaunted his wealth. In fact, he rarely spoke about his father's success at all. To him, Thomas Reynolds wasn't the CEO of an aviation empire. He was just dad. The man who helped him with his toughest math problems, who stayed up late on quizzing him for exams, and who always reminded him, "Your worth isn't in your skin color or your background. It's in how you carry yourself." Marcus had taken that lesson to heart. He didn't dress in flashy designer brands or wear expensive watches like the typical first-class passengers. Instead, he carried himself with quiet confidence, preferring to let his achievements speak for themselves. As he approached the Reynolds Elite Class Lounge, he was excited, not because of the luxury, but because, on the other side of this flight, his father was waiting for him. A warm hug, a family dinner, and the comfort of home awaited him. What he didn't know was that before he could board, he would have to fight for the very seat he had rightfully earned, and that a single act of discrimination would set off a chain of events that no one, especially not Madeline Brooks, saw coming. Marcus Reynolds stepped into the Reynolds Elite Class Lounge, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the soft hum of conversation. The plush leather seats in the muted jazz playing overhead created an atmosphere of quiet luxury. He settled into a seat by the window, his heart still pounding from the excitement of traveling first class for the first time. He placed his hot chocolate on the table and pulled out his phone, quickly typing a message. "I'm about to board the plane, Dad. Hope to see you soon." The reply came almost immediately. "Enjoy your trip, son. I'll be waiting for you at home." A faint smile tugged at Marcus' lips. Everything felt perfect, at least for now. But across the lounge, Madeline Brooks, the senior flight attendant with nearly 2 decades of experience, had already taken notice of him. From behind the service counter, her sharp, scrutinizing gaze followed the young black teenager as he sipped his drink. Dressed in a simple hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, Marcus did not match the image she had constructed in her mind of a real first-class passenger. Her lips pursed slightly, a small but unmistakable sign of disdain. "First class really is accessible to anyone these days," she whispered to the junior flight attendant beside her, her voice carrying just enough volume for the words to reach nearby ears. Her younger colleague stiffened but said nothing, lowering her head to continue organizing the guest list. Madeline, however, was not finished. With a deliberate motion, she ran a finger down the list of VIP passengers, her eyes narrowing as she reached the end. Marcus Reynolds, a name that didn't carry the weight of high-powered executives, wealthy heirs, or political elites. There must be some mistake, she thought. Passengers like him didn't belong here. The cool air from the lounge's air conditioning brushed against Marcus' face, but he remained unaware of the storm brewing behind him. He finished his drink, tucked his phone into his pocket, and stood as the announcement for first-class boarding filled the room. His fingers curled around the handle of his suitcase as he strode toward the boarding gate, his heart pounding with excitement at the thought of seeing his father after months apart. He had no idea that his journey home was about to take an unexpected turn. At gate A3, Madeline Brooks stood with practiced poise, her lips curved into a well-rehearsed smile. She greeted each first-class passenger with a nod, her voice sweet as honey. "Safe flight, Mr. Crawford. Always a pleasure to have you on board." "Welcome, Mrs. Parker. Your seat has been prepared with your favorite drink waiting." Her charm was effortless, reserved only for those she deemed worthy. Then Marcus stepped forward. The moment she laid eyes on him, her expression shifted. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. She glanced down at his ticket. First class, her eyebrows arched ever so slightly, as if she had just discovered something absurdly incorrect. She looked him over, from his short, curly black hair to his worn-out backpack, to his sneakers that showed signs of frequent wear. The disbelief in her face was clear. There was no way a boy like this had a legitimate first-class ticket. With a controlled breath, she forced a polite yet sharp tone into her voice. "Are you sure you are at the right gate?" Marcus blinked, momentarily confused. He looked at his ticket, then back at her. "Yes, ma'am, my ticket is for first class." He raised it slightly, making sure she could see the bold, unmistakable print. But Madeline barely glanced at it. Instead, her lips curled into an almost imperceptible smirk. "There might be a mistake in the system. First class isn't for everyone, you know." The words, though spoken softly, landed like a slap to the face. Marcus felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his face neutral. He had heard this tone before. It was the same voice people used when they wanted to tell him he didn't belong. In stores, in certain neighborhoods, in spaces reserved for important people. But he had spent his entire life proving people like Madeline wrong. "You can check again," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But I know my ticket is valid." A few passengers behind him began to whisper, their gazes flickering toward the scene unfolding. The tension thickened. Marcus held his ground, refusing to look away. For a long moment, Madeline didn't move. She simply stared at him as if daring him to back down. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she turned to the tablet in front of her and pretended to check the passenger list. A few seconds passed. Finally, she sighed. Dramatic, exaggerated. "Fine," she said, "but if there's a mistake, security will have to handle it." Without another word, she reluctantly scanned Marcus' ticket and waved him through, her jaw tightening as he walked past. But this wasn't over. She had already decided that before this flight ended, she would find a way to put him back in his place. As Marcus walked toward the aircraft, he exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the weight of the encounter. He had dealt with people like Madeline before. But something about this felt different. Inside the Reynolds Elite Class cabin, Marcus found his seat near the window. The leather was soft beneath him, the space around him quiet, filled only with the murmurs of wealthy passengers sipping champagne. He tried to relax, but from the front of the cabin, Madeline's gaze still lingered. She whispered something to a fellow flight attendant, then straightened her uniform with a pointed sharpness. She wasn't done with him yet. And Marcus had no idea that before this flight landed, he would be at the center of a scandal that would shake the entire airline industry. Marcus Reynolds stood his ground, holding the first-class ticket firmly in both hands, his gaze unwavering as he looked at Madeline Brooks. The tension around the boarding gate thickened. the soft hum of conversation shifting into hushed murmurs as passengers behind him exchanged glances. Some were mild curiosity, others thinly veiled judgment. Madeline wasn't used to being questioned. She had expected Marcus to back down, to mutter an apology, and retreat to economy, where in her mind he truly belonged. Instead, he remained calm, composed, and worst of all, unshaken. Her lips curled ever so slightly as she turned toward the tablet at her podium, making a show of checking the system while her mind raced for another way to get rid of him. "Fine," she finally sighed, her voice laced with forced patience. "I'll verify your ticket, but don't be surprised if there was an error in the system." She turned her attention to the screen, but she wasn't looking for confirmation. She was stalling. Marcus sensed it immediately. This wasn't about a simple verification. It was about sending a message. Behind him, the line of first-class passengers shifted restlessly. A businessman in a gray suit checked his watch. A middle-aged woman clutching a designer handbag sighed in impatience. Someone muttered, "Holding up the line." Marcus clenched the strap of his backpack, forcing himself to stay calm. He had been in situations like this before. Moments where his presence was questioned, his worth subtly challenged, all without a single slur being uttered. It was always in the tone, the hesitation, the unnecessary scrutiny. But he had also been taught by his father that standing tall was more important than raising his voice. "I'll wait," Marcus said simply, his voice steady. Madeline's eyes flicked up at him, irritation flashing across her face. He was too calm. That meant he wasn't intimidated. That meant she had to try harder. With a long, exaggerated breath, she nodded and turned back to the screen, fingers tapping slowly against the counter, deliberately dragging out the process. The seconds stretched. A few feet away, a father adjusted the cap on his young son's head, gently nudging him forward. The little boy, no older than 7, stared at Marcus curiously, eyes wide as if sensing something was wrong, but too young to understand exactly why. The father pulled him along, whispering something under his breath. Marcus swallowed, forcing the growing tightness in his chest to subside. He would not be moved. Then finally Madeline sighed heavily. "Well, it seems your ticket is valid after all," she announced, as if it were a personal disappointment. Marcus tilted his head slightly, watching her reaction. A normal employee, after realizing a mistake, would apologize. But Madeline didn't. She simply held onto her pride, her lips pressed into a thin line as she waved him through. "You may board," she said, her voice clipped. "For now." The words were meant to remind him that this wasn't over. Marcus knew that much instinctively. He grabbed his suitcase and stepped past the boarding gate, the feeling of countless eyes pressing into his back. But even as he entered the luxurious first-class cabin, he could still feel her stare lingering behind him. And he was right. This wasn't over. Not yet. Marcus placed his backpack beside his window seat, exhaling softly as he tried to shake off the encounter at the gate. The first-class cabin was spacious, quiet, and filled with the scent of fresh leather and subtle perfume. Flight attendants moved with polished grace, offering champagne and warm towels to passengers already settled in. Marcus, however, had no interest in either. Instead, he pulled out his phone and quickly texted his father. "Boarded the plane. See you soon." The reply came almost instantly. "Looking forward to it, son. Safe flight." A sense of warmth filled Marcus' chest. His father had always made him feel safe. But that safety didn't extend to everyone else on this flight. Across the cabin, Madeline Brooks watched him carefully. She whispered something to a junior flight attendant, then turned back to the passenger manifest on her tablet. There had to be a way to remove him. She just had to find it. A soft ding overhead signaled the captain's pre-flight announcement. Passengers settled in, flight attendants secured overhead bins, and the cabin crew moved swiftly to prepare for takeoff. Just as Marcus relaxed into his seat, a shadow fell over him. He looked up and found Madeline standing right beside him. Her expression was polite, but her eyes were sharp. Mr. Reynolds, she said, her voice sickly sweet. I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but there seems to be an issue with your seat assignment. Marcus' fingers tightened slightly around his phone. An issue? She nodded, a thin, artificial smile on her lips. Yes, there seems to have been an error when processing your reservation. Your ticket was mistakenly issued for first class, but in reality, your seat is located in economy. I'm afraid we'll need you to move. Silence. The words hung in the air like a dagger. Marcus felt every muscle in his body tense, but his expression remained calm. Around them, passengers subtly leaned in, their curiosity piqued. This was no mistake. This was exactly what she had wanted from the start. A way to get rid of him. Marcus inhaled slowly, deeply, his father's voice echoing in his mind. Your dignity is never up for negotiation, son, but you choose how you defend it. He raised his gaze to meet Madeline's head-on. That's impossible, he said smoothly. My ticket was booked directly by Reynolds Aviation. My father purchased it himself. For the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed Madeline's face. She hadn't expected him to push back so quickly. She took a breath, readying another excuse. Well, sometimes the system... Marcus cut her off. If there's an issue, let's call the captain. The confidence in his voice made her pause. Passengers around them stiffened slightly, sensing the tension. Marcus didn't look away. He knew she wouldn't involve the captain, because she knew the truth, and she knew that if she pushed too far, this would not end well for her. For a brief second, she hesitated. Then, without another word, she forced a tight smile and stepped back. Enjoy your flight, Mr. Reynolds, she said, her tone clipped before turning on her heel and walking away. Marcus exhaled softly, watching her retreat. She wasn't finished. Not yet. And neither was he. Marcus Reynolds stood his ground as the atmosphere around him thickened with tension. The weight of dozens of eyes bore down on him, some filled with curiosity, others with silent judgment. He wasn't waiting in anxiety or doubt. He knew his place, and he knew his right. The first-class ticket in his hand was more than just a seat assignment. It was proof that he belonged, no matter how much Madeline Brooks wished to deny it. Still, whispers spread through the line behind him like wildfire. What's taking so long? A man in a suit murmured. Can't he just move already? Sighed an older woman clutching a designer handbag. A few passengers shot him subtle smirks, their expressions saying exactly what they were thinking, that this young black man would eventually be sent back to economy, just as they expected from the moment they saw him at the gate. But Marcus didn't move. He stood with an unshakable calm, waiting as Madeline marched toward the check-in screen, her stiff posture betraying her frustration. She was determined to find a way to prove herself right, convinced that she would uncover a mistake in the system. Marcus watched her carefully, his grip tightening slightly on his backpack strap. He had done nothing wrong, yet the entire scene was unfolding as if he had committed a crime, as if simply existing in first class was an offense. As the tension stretched, passengers in line grew restless. A few rolled their eyes, others checked their watches, making exaggerated sighs, as though Marcus' mere presence was a personal inconvenience. But Marcus had learned long ago not to shrink under pressure. He had felt this type of scrutiny before. The stares, the whispers, the way people's expectations tried to push him into a lesser space. But he would not be moved. Madeline returned moments later, clutching a tablet. Her eyes flicked over Marcus once more, but this time there was a hint of satisfaction in them, as if she had found what she was looking for. She stepped closer, leaning in slightly, her voice just low enough to seem private, yet loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. I'll say this one last time, young man, she said, dragging out the words with mocking emphasis. Then lowering her voice but keeping her tone dripping with false politeness, she added, this place is really not for people like you. The words hit like a cold slap, not because Marcus was surprised, but because he had heard them before. She let the sentence hang in the air, letting the meaning sink in for the surrounding passengers. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some pretending not to hear, others exchanging knowing glances. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly turned his ticket to face her, holding it at chest level, his voice steady but sharp. "I don't think this is how a head stewardess should speak to a first-class passenger." A pause. Some passengers stiffened, sensing that Marcus was not going to back down. "I'm willing to wait," he continued, calm and unwavering. "And if necessary, I'll let security verify my ticket. But I'm not leaving because I've done nothing wrong." Silence crashed over the area. Even those who had been avoiding eye contact were now fully invested in what was unfolding before them. No one expected a young black man to remain this composed and firm under the unspoken weight of prejudice. Madeline pressed her lips together, her eyes flickering toward the crowd. She had wanted to make Marcus feel out of place, but now she was the one under scrutiny. Yet she was not ready to back down. Instead, she gave a cold nod, then turned to one of her colleagues, signaling them to call security. "Well then, wait a little longer," she said, her voice carrying a venomous edge. "Let's see who truly doesn't belong here." A small, satisfied smirk crept onto her lips, unaware that from this moment on, the situation was no longer in her control. Minutes later, two security officers approached the gate. Their footsteps echoed against the sleek airport floor, each step deliberate and firm. Marcus watched them closely, his expression unreadable. He still held on to a faint hope that this would be resolved fairly, that once they saw the validity of his ticket, the situation would end. But the moment one of the officers spoke, that hope shattered like glass. "Sir, please come with us. We'll guide you to your assigned seat." It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. Marcus felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. So this was how it was going to be. He inhaled deeply, his father's voice echoing in his mind. "Your dignity is never up for negotiation, son, but you choose how you defend it." He gripped his backpack straps, choosing his next words carefully. "I appreciate your help, officers," he said smoothly, his voice even and controlled. "But there's been no mistake. My ticket is for first class. If you need further confirmation, I suggest we call the captain." The response was calculated and precise, delivered not in anger, but with undeniable authority. The officers hesitated for a second, glancing at each other. Madeline's expression twitched slightly, as if she had not expected Marcus to fight back so directly. Passengers whispered louder, a few murmuring, "Maybe they should check his ticket properly. This is looking bad for them." Madeline sensed the shift. If she pushed too hard now, she could end up in trouble herself. She pursed her lips, then exhaled sharply, her voice tight with forced politeness. "Fine. If you insist, we'll call the captain." She turned, signaling for her colleague to fetch him. Marcus remained standing, his heart steady, his grip on his ticket firm. This wasn't over. Not yet. Marcus Reynolds sat stiffly in his seat, staring at the tiny airplane window. The sun glowed faintly on the horizon, its warm golden light brushing against the fragile glass. But Marcus didn't feel its warmth. Instead, he felt the weight of what had just happened. His hands rested motionless in his lap, his fingers curled slightly, not in anger but in silent resistance, a refusal to let this moment define him. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't argued, he hadn't begged, but the message was clear. They didn't want him in first class. No one had spoken up. No one had stepped forward and said, "This is wrong." Some passengers had looked away, pretending they hadn't seen. Others had whispered quietly, casting quick glances at Marcus as if waiting for the moment he would break, as if waiting to see if he would shrink under the weight of humiliation. But Marcus had walked to the economy section with his head held high. And now he sat there, pressing his lips together tightly, willing himself not to let out a single sound, not a sigh, Not a word, and certainly not a tear. Because if he let it slip, if he let the frustration bubbling inside him escape, then everything they expected from him would become true. He wouldn't give them that. Not today. Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers moving steadily as he typed. "Dad, they moved me to economy. The flight attendant said my ticket was a mistake. But I know it wasn't. I don't want to make a scene. But this is unfair." He pressed send, then he leaned back, exhaling slowly, letting his eyes drift shut for just a moment, because he knew what was coming. Madeline Brooks was smiling. She leaned casually against the beverage station, adjusting her hair in the small mirror attached to the mini fridge. To her, everything was finally in order. She had successfully removed an unwanted distraction, ensuring that first class remained exactly as she believed it should be: exclusive, refined, and free of unnecessary disruptions. In her mind, this was simply a minor inconvenience, a task handled. What she didn't realize was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career, because at that very moment, deep within the cockpit, a phone was ringing, a direct call from Victor Reynolds himself. Captain Daniel Cooper was a man of precision and discipline. With over 2 decades of experience piloting international flights, he had seen it all: technical failures, passenger disputes, even emergency landings. But when the emergency phone rang with a priority call from the airline's owner, he felt something tighten in his chest. He knew that name. Victor Reynolds was not just the CEO of Reynolds Aviation, he was a legend. And when Victor Reynolds spoke, people listened. The captain picked up the receiver, his tone crisp and professional. "This is Captain Cooper." The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an edge to it, sharp, clear, unwavering. "Captain, I just received a message from my son, Marcus Reynolds." The captain straightened immediately. Victor continued. He was removed from his first-class seat under the claim that his ticket was a mistake. "I want you to verify this immediately." Captain Cooper swallowed. Victor's words weren't loud. He wasn't yelling, but the command was there. "I don't care what reasons have been given," Victor said, his voice like a blade slicing through the still air of the cockpit. "I want this corrected. Now." A pause, then a final directive. "And pay close attention to how your head flight attendant has handled this situation." Captain Cooper didn't hesitate. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds, I'll handle this personally." The line went dead. Captain Cooper placed the phone back onto its receiver, his mind already racing. This was no longer just a passenger dispute. This was a crisis, and at the center of it was Madeline Brooks. The announcement came moments later. A flight attendant knocked softly on the galley door where Madeline stood, still basking in the afterglow of her small victory. "Ms. Brooks, the captain has requested to see you." Madeline blinked. "The captain?" A flicker of unease crept down her spine, but she quickly masked it. Straightening her uniform, she nodded and walked toward the cockpit. But as she moved, she noticed something different. The other flight attendants were watching her. Their expressions weren't the usual submissive nods or neutral professionalism. No, there was a shift, a subtle, unmistakable change in the air. Madeline ignored it. Whatever the captain wanted, she was sure she could handle it. After all, she had been doing this job for nearly 2 decades. What could possibly go wrong? Marcus felt his phone vibrate. He glanced down. His father had read the message. There was no response. Not a single word. Marcus's heart beat steadily. He knew what that meant. His father didn't send long replies. He didn't waste words. And when he went silent, it meant things were already in motion. Marcus exhaled slowly. He didn't know exactly what was about to happen. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marcus Reynolds sat quietly, his gaze distant as he stared out the airplane window. The world outside was a sea of clouds, endless and untouched, stretching far beyond the reach of human pettiness. The soft hum of the plane's engines filled the air, but it did nothing to silence the storm brewing inside him. He had been taught patience, had learned resilience, had been raised to pick his battles carefully. But this was different. This was blatant. This was humiliation dressed as protocol. And yet, Marcus held his head high. In his hand, his phone screen still glowed from the last message sent to his father. No response yet. Not that Marcus needed one. His father never reacted in haste. When Victor Reynolds was silent, it meant he was already acting. The tightness in Marcus's chest loosened just a little at that thought. And then, movement, a shift in the air. Marcus didn't look up immediately, but he could feel it. The murmur of whispers, the subtle rustling of fabric, the hesitant footsteps of someone who was not used to hesitating. He didn't need to turn his head to know who it was. Madeline Brooks. She had found him. Madeline walked fast, but not too fast. Her poise, the cold, collected demeanor she had always carried, was still there. But this time it was a mass slipping at the edges. Her hands were clammy, her breath too shallow. She had been through tense situations before. Disruptive passengers, emergencies, rerouted flights. She had handled them all with professional grace. But this was something else entirely. Never, not once in her 2 decades of experience, had she ever made a mistake this large. And now she was face to face with the consequences. Marcus didn't move when Madeline stopped beside his seat, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge her presence. For the first time in her career, she was the one waiting for attention. Clearing her throat softly, she finally spoke. Mr. Reynolds. The name felt foreign on her tongue. Marcus blinked once, as if slowly coming back to reality. Then finally he looked up. Their eyes met, one gaze steely and unyielding, the other fractured. The way she had spoken his name, with unease, with caution, said more than any apology could. But Marcus wasn't going to make this easy for her. He let the silence stretch between them, let her squirm. Then finally he spoke. Yes? Just one word, level, calm. But it was enough to make Madeline shift uncomfortably. She opened her mouth, then closed it. This was harder than she thought. She had expected anger, expected defiance. She knew how to handle rage. But this was something far worse. It was unshaken dignity. There seems to have been a misunderstanding, Madeline finally said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding, he repeated. The disbelief in his tone made Madeline's stomach twist. She could feel the passengers around them listening now. She could feel the weight of their eyes. The same passengers who had once silently agreed with her actions were now watching her unravel. And Marcus? Marcus knew exactly what was happening. From the cockpit, Captain Cooper stood watching the live feed from the plane's security cameras. Every first-class flight had them, discreetly placed throughout the cabin for security purposes. He had seen everything, from the moment Madeline had turned Marcus away at the gate to the way she had subtly encouraged the security guards to remove him from his seat. He had watched it unfold in real time, and now he was watching her squirm. Good. Captain Cooper picked up the radio, pressing the button that linked directly to the flight crew's intercom. His voice was steady, unwavering, absolute. Miss Brooks. The sudden announcement made Madeline freeze. Passengers turned their heads in confusion. Marcus smirked. Report to the first-class cabin immediately. For the first time in 20 years, Madeline hesitated. She had never been called out like this before. She swallowed thickly, glancing at Marcus one last time before stepping away. And in that moment, Marcus knew. Whatever was about to happen next, it wasn't going to be in her favor. Madeline stepped into first class with shaking hands. The passengers in the cabin, the same ones who had silently judged Marcus earlier, were now looking at her. Judging her. Captain Cooper stood near the cockpit door, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Behind him, 2 security officers stood waiting. The very same ones who had escorted Marcus to economy. Only this time they weren't here for Marcus. They were here for her. Captain Cooper didn't waste time. Madeline Brooks, per direct orders from airline management, you are hereby relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. The air shifted. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers whispered, wide-eyed. But Captain Cooper wasn't done. Effective immediately, you are instructed to vacate the first-class cabin. Madeline stared. She tried to form words, but nothing came out. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever stripped her of authority. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. Her mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to say. With slow, disbelieving steps, she turned. Passengers shifted away as she passed. No one spoke. No one offered comfort. Because in that moment, they knew. They had seen who she was, and so had she. As she walked, her gaze drifted toward economy, and there, through the dividing curtain, she locked eyes with Marcus. He was watching her, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far worse, indifference, as if she no longer mattered. And in that moment, she understood. The real punishment was never the loss of her title. It was the loss of her power, because the people who once feared her no longer did. As the minutes passed, the whispers spread like wildfire. What had once been a silent injustice was now a conversation between passengers who couldn't ignore what they had seen. The atmosphere on the flight had shifted. Passengers in first class who had once looked at Marcus Reynolds with cold disinterest now exchanged uncertain glances. Some of them tapped nervously at their watches. Some pretended to read their newspapers. But no one could ignore what had just happened. Marcus still sat calmly, gazing out of the window, not as a victim, but as someone who refused to be shaken. The hum of the airplane engines remained steady as Captain Daniel Cooper adjusted his microphone. His voice, normally warm and professional, was now calculated, deliberate, and weighted. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. A ripple went through the cabin. Passengers paused. Some turned their heads toward the intercom speakers. Others lowered their drinks, sensing something was different. Even Marcus looked up. It has come to my attention that there was a serious mistake made on this flight regarding a first-class passenger. Marcus's grip on the armrest tightened slightly. The passengers in economy, who had all seen what happened, straightened in their seats. Up in first class, some nervous glances were exchanged. Passenger Marcus Reynolds, your ticket was always valid. You were wrongfully removed from your assigned seat. Madeline Brooks, still standing in first class, froze. Her face drained of color. The passengers around her whispered. Some glared, others just stared at her. On behalf of Reynolds Aviation, I extend my deepest apologies for this error. There was a heavy silence. Madeline swallowed hard. She could feel the judgment pressing in from every direction. Madeline forced herself to move. Her breath was shallow, her carefully polished professionalism crumbling beneath the weight of her mistake. She turned back toward economy, each step feeling like she was walking toward a guillotine. She reached Marcus's seat. His eyes met hers. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't offer her any relief. And Madeline, for the first time in her career, was the one forced to look away. She clasped her hands together tightly, inhaled sharply, and finally spoke. Her voice, though composed, carried a faint tremor. Mr. Reynolds, she began, forcing out the words. I deeply regret the inconvenience you have faced. She hesitated. She knew that nothing she said now would erase what had happened. She had taken a young man's dignity and treated it like it was hers to control, and now the power had shifted. I invite you to return to your rightful seat in first class. Marcus studied her. A long, unshaken silence stretched between them. He could feel everyone watching, every passenger who had sat by in silence when she had humiliated him, every voice that had been too afraid to speak up then, but now whispered in judgment. But Marcus had already decided. His voice, steady and composed, cut through the moment like a blade. No, thank you. The entire cabin went still. Madeline blinked. Passengers in economy turned toward each other, murmuring. Up in first class, there were a few stunned gasps. Marcus wasn't taking the seat back. He wasn't playing their game. Madeline faltered. Sir, please. She tried again. You don't need to stay here. We can make sure you're comfortable in first class. But Marcus only shook his head. His voice remained polite, but his refusal was final. I'm already comfortable where I am. Madeline knew there was nothing left to say. She had played her role, and now she was nothing. With a final nod, she turned on her heel, and this time, she walked away without power. Marcus exhaled slowly. He could feel the tension lifting. Passengers around him nodded in quiet approval. The young woman beside him smiled. That, she whispered, was perfect. The older woman a few seats down gave a quiet nod of respect. For the first time since stepping onto the flight, Marcus felt something shift, not just on this plane, but within himself. It wasn't just about one flight attendant. It wasn't just about one seat. It was about every time someone had been told they didn't belong. Every time someone had been made to feel small. But not today. Today he had refused, and everyone had seen it. As the plane continued its journey, Marcus's phone buzzed. He looked down. A single message from his father. Victor Reynolds, well done, son. And Marcus? He smiled, not a big one, not a triumphant one, just a quiet, knowing smile, because he had never needed first class to prove who he was. As the minutes stretched into hours, the weight of the captain's announcement hung over the cabin like a storm cloud refusing to pass. Passengers who had once been silent observers now whispered openly, exchanging glances of disapproval and judgment. The entire aircraft had become a courtroom in the sky, and the verdict had already been decided. Madeline Brooks, once the undisputed authority of the first-class cabin, now sat rigid in her seat. Her hands trembled slightly, her perfectly rehearsed professionalism cracking like shattered glass. She could feel the eyes on her. Every single passenger who had witnessed what had happened, every single flight crew member who suddenly avoided her gaze, and worst of all, she could feel the power slipping from her grasp.